September 1916. The Somme. The air is wet with cordite and rotting earth. The ground isn't ground anymore. It's a churned, black soup. A British infantryman peers over the lip of a trench. Ahead, wire, then more wire, and beyond that, a German machine. Gun nest invisible until it fires. The whistles blow. Men climb the ladders. Boots sink. Rifles wobble. And the battlefield wakes up. Then, something else wakes up. A shape crawls out of the mist. Steel plates, rivets, tracks. Not a horse, not a gun carriage, a moving building. It lurches forward like it's alive. The first tanks were not sleek. They were not fast. They were not reliable. They were ugly, loud, slow, and to a lot of observers, on both sides, they were a joke, a novelty, a British desperation machine. But what they didn't know was that the joke wasn't the tank. The joke was the old way of fighting, the idea that you could keep feeding men into wire and machine guns, and call it strategy. Because once a tank appeared on a battlefield, the war stopped being about courage in a trench, and started becoming about systems, industry, coordination, and machines that could move under fire. This story is about the moment Britain's ridiculous invention became the blueprint for modern war. It's about early failures that looked like proof the critics were right, hidden strengths that only showed themselves in the mud, and one terrifying realization, shared by everyone who saw it, that the battlefield had just evolved. Britain mocked the tank. Then it changed World War I. By 1915, the Western Front had turned into a meat grinder with no exit. The problem wasn't bravery. The problem was geometry. Trenches formed long, interlocking lines. Machine guns covered every approach. Barbed wire slowed attackers to a walk. And artillery, mass artillery, turned open ground into craters. The result was a kind of stalemate that didn't feel like a stalemate. Felt like constant motion, with no movement. 1,000 yards gained, then lost, then gained again, and for every yard, a price paid in thousands of lives. Britain needed something that could do three things at once: cross trenches, crush wire, and survive machine gun fire long enough to matter. Not a new rifle, not a better helmet, a new category of weapon. Inside British leadership circles, the idea began to form: a landship, an armored vehicle that could carry firepower forward, without being instantly shredded. Committee formed, engineers sketched, factories experimented, and slowly, the impossible started becoming buildable. But the first tanks were a nightmare to create. The engines were underpowered. The steering was brutal. The suspension, if you could call it that, was primitive. Inside, crews worked in a metal box filled with heat, fumes, and noise. The air could become thick with exhaust. Oil and grease coated everything. Metal fragments and rivet splinters could ricochet inside when bullets struck the armor. And speed? Speed was almost an insult. Early British tanks moved at something like walking pace, on good ground. On the Somme, there wasn't good ground. There was only mud, and mud has its own physics. Worse, they broke, constantly. Tracks slipped, engines overheated, gearboxes failed. Some tanks never even reached the start line. So even before combat, the tank earned a reputation: expensive, unreliable, and, worst of all, embarrassing. When the tanks finally appeared at the Somme, the reaction was not immediate terror. Not at first. In some places, German troops fired and watched bullets spark off armor. In other places, they simply waited for the machine to die on its own. Because many did. This was the enemy confidence moment. The moment where the skeptics felt vindicated. A slow, rattling steel box comes forward, and then stops, stuck, broken. A giant target. And you can almost imagine the reaction in the trenches. So this is the British miracle weapon. Toy. a worthless contraption, a thing you laugh at, right up until it doesn't stop. Because when a tank worked, even briefly, it did something no infantry assault could. It ignored wire. It didn't crawl through it. It didn't cut it, crushed it. It didn't leap trenches. It didn't build bridges, crossed them. And as it moved, it carried guns with it. Not artillery firing from miles away, but direct fire close enough to hit the mouth of a machine gun nest. This was the hidden strength. The tank didn't need to be fast. It needed to be unstoppable. It needed to be the one thing on the battlefield that didn't have to ask permission from the machine gun. And once that idea existed, even in crude form, it couldn't be uninvented. Now picture a single tank in 1916. Not a formation, not a coordinated armored attack. One tank. It crawls forward under artillery bursts that shake the ground like earthquakes. The tracks grind and slip. The engine roars, then coughs, then roars again. Inside, the crew is half blind from fumes. They shout to hear each other over the mechanical violence. Hands burn on hot metal. Every impact sounds like a hammer blow to the skull. Ahead, a belt of wire. Behind the wire, German infantry, confident in their geometry. Because wire plus machine gun equals death. The tank reaches the wire. The wire doesn't stop it. It folds. It snaps. It disappears under the tracks like straw. And in that moment, the rules break. German rifle fire intensifies. Bullets spark. Some rounds punch through weak points. A few ricochet and send metal splinters into the crew compartment. But the tank keeps moving. It reaches the trench line. And then comes the part no one was prepared for. It doesn't fall into the trench. It straddles it. The nose rises. The hull tilts. The tracks bite the far lip. And the tank climbs out like a monster pulling itself over a wall. Now it's behind the line. And suddenly the German trench isn't a fortress. It's a corridor. The tank's guns fire into positions that were designated to kill men coming from the front. But the tank isn't a man. It's a machine that has entered the trench system from an angle the system was never built to handle. This is the cinematic moment, the moment where the war feels like it's flickering into a new era. And for the infantry watching behind it, for the first time in months, there is something moving forward that isn't dying instantly. And that's when the real lesson begins. Because Britain's early mistake was thinking tanks were just armored infantry. That you could send them forward like brave individuals. One here, one there, and they'd magically solve the trench problem. They couldn't. Not like that. The doctrine shift was brutal but simple. Stop fighting tanks like cavalry. Stop using them as lone heroes. Fight tanks like artillery that moves. Fight tanks like a system. Mass them. Coordinate them. Time them with creeping barrages. Pair them with infantry. And give them objectives that match what they can actually do. Not sprint across the battlefield, but break the wire, cross the trenches, smash the strong points, and open the door. Because tanks weren't the whole solution. They were the battering ram. And in November 1917, Britain proved it at Cambrai. Cambrai wasn't just another offensive. It was a demonstration. Instead of warning the enemy with days of artillery, the British aimed for surprise. Hundreds of tanks were gathered. On the order of several hundred. Not scattered. Not symbolic. Massed. When the attack began, the tanks moved with infantry and with artillery support time to the advance. Wire vanished under tracks. Trenches were crossed. Strong points were isolated. And for a moment, just a moment, the Western Front did something it almost never did. It moved. Cambrai showed what tanks could do when used the right way. It also showed their limits. Mechanical failures still happened. And once the initial shock faded, defenders adapted. But the proof was on the map. The line had been bent by machines. The mockery was getting harder to justify. After Cambrai, the tank didn't disappear. It evolved. British designs improved. Armor layouts were refined. Tracks became more robust. Engines were adjusted. Reliability slowly climbed. Models like the Mark IV and later variants were part of an ongoing industrial experiment. How do you build a machine that can survive a battlefield that destroys everything? Because the tank wasn't just fighting Germans. It was fighting mud, craters, wire, trenches, and physics. And every upgrade wasn't glamorous. Some were boring. Stronger components, better track design, improved maintenance procedures. But those boring upgrades were the difference between a tank that breaks down in no man's land and a tank that reaches the trench line. Then the tank's role expanded. It started as a trench breaker, a solution to a specific nightmare. But once commanders saw what armored vehicles could do, they began to imagine new jobs: support infantry advances, suppress machine guns, carry supplies forward, exploit breakthroughs, hold ground under fire. And more importantly, tanks began shaping how soldiers thought. The battlefield was no longer only about lines and trenches. It was about movement under protection. It was about combining firepower with armor. And that concept would not stay in 1917. It would grow teeth in the decades to come. Now comes the math of destruction, the part that separates a battlefield trick from a world-changing weapon. A tank is not just steel and guns. A tank is fuel, spare parts, recovery vehicles, workshops, mechanics, training, and replacements. If your tank breaks, you don't just lose a machine. You lose the hours it took to build it, ship it, fuel it, and get a crew trained enough to operate it under fire. And in World War I, training tank crews was not like training infantry. These men had to understand engines, gears, weapon handling inside a moving box, navigation through smoke, coordination with infantry who might be terrified of the machine itself. And factories had to scale. Steel plate, rivets, engines, tracks. It was an industrial commitment. A promise that Britain would keep building even when early models failed and critics laughed. Because tanks weren't a one-off invention. They were a production line idea. By the end of the war, tanks carried a psychological weight far beyond their speed or armor. They were loud. They were huge. They were unnatural. For defenders, they represented something terrifying. The enemy had found a way through the geometry. And once that fear exists, it spreads faster than any machine. Timeline, in seconds. 1916, Somme. Shock, confusion, early breakdowns. 1917, Cambrai. Mast proof and doctrine awakening. 1918, tanks become part of the combined arms future. And by then, even the enemy assessment had shifted. Not a joke, not a toy, but a weapon category that had to be answered. After the war, the tank didn't fade into history. It became history. The same machine, once mocked for being slow and unreliable, would become the centerpiece of 20th century land warfare. And that's the payoff. Britain laughed at the tank. The enemy laughed at the tank. Even the tank crews probably laughed when they weren't choking on exhaust and praying the engine held. But the trenches didn't get the last word. The tank did, and the final punchline is this. In World War I, the most important weapon wasn't the one that killed the most men. It was the one that made the battlefield move again. Because once war starts moving, everything changes.